Welcome to World News. I'm Jose Martinez.
And I'm John Doe.
And today we'll be interviewing honored guests Getu Faleke and Dr. Dramani Ashanti about the research and what has been going on in Ethiopia and later Ghana over the last few decades. First, we'll be interviewing Getu Faleke about the art, education, and cultural changes that have been occurring in Ethiopia. I'm Jose Martinez, World News.
Global news. When you want it, where you want it, how you want it.
Now, Mr. Getu Faleke, you've been telling me that the Ethiopian artistic movement has been on an uproar for some time. How have you observed that this has taken effect on the Ethiopian art world?
Well, Dave, I can tell you that art in Ethiopia has changed quite a lot over the last few years. From the 1940s to the 1960s, Ethiopia has seen a birth of three new types of artistic movements: realistic, impressionist, and abstractionism, mirroring that of the rest of the world.
Yes, I've heard of these. How have they been distinguished from each other?
Of course, they've been gaining popularity dramatically, while the realistic or naturalistic movement has focused on patriotism and very much based off of what the country is going through. And of course, there's the impressionist style of art that has newly come up recently. This art type is much more serious in its intention and is to depict some of the sadder situations within our society, namely suffering. It is partly political in nature. Finally, there's a representation of spirituality through new Western art visuals. And where did these Western ideals come into Ethiopian culture?
Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974, had his own ideas for how Ethiopian education should improve. He saw the Western worlds, like Russia and the United States, and the successes that they were having in education, and wanted to model their systems in order to best meet his people's needs.
It's a very different place than the countries you speak of. Was this a realistic goal?
It was not. You were correct in saying that the countries were different, and what Selassie should have done with education was to design it from the ground up so that Ethiopia could become successful. Ethiopia was in need of rebuilding, unlike the other countries, so learning complex maths and sciences was not in the interest of the people.
Focus on emulating any one country?
At first, many of the educators of Ethiopia were American-born, or at least American-taught. Prior to the 1960s, Selassie encouraged Ethiopia to adopt America's cookie-cutter approach to education, teaching the same basic math, English, and science requirements to everyone.
Did they then change these countries?
Yes, he did. It was more of a choice of the people rather than Selassie. Marxist ideas began to crop up, and many Americans were ousted from the country, being replaced by those with Soviet ideas. This didn't improve the education.
Was Ethiopia's education ever at its prime? What can you tell us about the change in Ethiopian culture as a result of European colonization? And where did these Western ideals come into Ethiopian culture?
There was a large change in the religion, with many people converting to evangelicalism, and following that came the founding of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
I think that despite the short period of time of the Italian colonization, that there was still a lot of religion and spiritual changes happening in the Ethiopian community.
Yes.
That's all the time we have. Thank you, and thank you. We'll see you next time.
Fascinating. Well, that's what we have for Ethiopian World News. Next, we'll be talking to Dr. Dramani Ashanti about what he has to say about art, education, and the cultural changes happening in Ghana.
Global news. When you want it, where you want it, how you want it.
Now we're joined with Dr. Dramani Ashanti, expert on Ghana's art history and the many other cultural changes that occurred during and after colonization. His new book, Completing the Puzzle, Kwame Nkrumah's Journey of Putting Ghana's Culture Back Together, is in stores now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Can you tell us what you focus on in your new book?
Yes, when Ghana was known as the Gold Coast and was under control by the British, cultural progress was disrupted and many aspects destroyed. I focused my book on art and its regeneration in the country after Ghana's independence in 1857.
So we can assume that art wasn't encouraged during colonization.
Yes, mostly. During the 10-year plan, essentially a piece of legislation that highlighted areas for social development, Schools were built and given a percentage of the budget, but art wasn't healthily encouraged. There were no natural artistic identity in the country. It was more common that independent artists would complete works, but there wasn't really any outlet to sell, trade, or appreciate art. As you know, art can be dangerous for the government, and the British wanted and had tight control over the people. They thought that artistic expression could spread ideas that they would view as threatening.
Kwame Nkrumah wanted to change this?
Absolutely. Of course, he couldn't do much during colonization, but after Ghana's independence, this was a priority of his. One of his main goals was to, along with the political developments, promote social development. Part of this social development meant creating a single national culture. To do this, he promoted arts of many kinds, from physical to performance, all in the effort to replant the cultural seeds that had been uprooted by the British.
Was it effective?
Eventually, many programs were created to help bring local art movements together to combine them into national art movements. One of the main programs was an annual art show organized by the Art Council of Ghana. This show would be moved to a new location each year, usually the capital of a territory different from the last. The thought behind this method was to try and link the country together, ensure that people from all over the country should visit other parts, bringing a little bit of culture.
What would be an example of traditional art from Ghana?
Art in Ghana ranged from useful things like baskets and pots to other things that were created to be visually pleasing. As art developed, some of the useful and beautiful ideas came together to combine and create some unique pieces. In the 60s, artists began sculpting and painting coffins for the dead. While this was common in certain areas at first, it spread just as the president had planned. But coffins would go with your profession. If you were a hunter during your life, maybe they would be an eagle coffin. If you were a photographer, you might lie in a giant camera coffin.
Nkrumah's plan was successful after all.
Indeed it was. You can find many more examples of combining local cultures in Ghana, some of which I talk about in my book. As times have become more recent, European art and style has become popular, but many artists have stayed traditional.
And sometimes traditional is the way to go. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Dramani Ashanti talking about his new book, Completing the Puzzle, Kwame Nkrumah's journey of putting Ghana's culture back together. Thank you for watching. From what I hear, Ghana's education system has been making a lot of progress over the last few decades. Care to comment on this?
Of course. Well, the Ghanaian educational system has certainly made a lot of progress since the informal homeschooling that the youth would receive, or even the castle schools set up by the British colonial administration that replaced it in the 1600s. More recently, Ghana used missionary schools to educate and admittedly bring to Christianity Ghanaian children. But systems like this have gone under quite a bit of scrutiny in the 20th century. From the 1920s to the 1940s, an educationalist committee was instated, and many improvements to the education system that we now have been made. One controversy I'd like to point out that there is that there have been complaints that the educational system of northern Ghana has benefited far less than of the southern region. A modernized education is what we need. After Ghana received its independence in 1957, the country started putting even more of a focus on education. At the time of independence, 25% of the population was literate, a, might I add, number high for the colony at the time.
Daniel, for those enlightening words. And to enter a bit on the Ghanaian education system, perhaps some words from Sir Gordon Gugisberg, governor of the Gold Coast in Ghana from 1920. One of the greatest mistakes of the education in the past has been this, that it has taught to the African to become European instead of remaining African. This is entirely wrong, and the government recognizes it. In the future, our education will aim at making an African remain an African and taking interest in his own country. So can you tell us a little bit about Ghanaian culture and how it's changed as a result of the colonization by the British?
Of course, just as in other parts of colonized Africa, the British came to Africa and basically, in summary, made it their duty to change Ghanaian culture, religion, government, socioeconomic structure, etc., to that of the British and European structure. That influence is still felt today in modern Ghanaian popular culture.
Why did they do this?
Well, there are many theories and a lot of research on this, so I won't dive into that very much. But in general, they thought it was the right thing to do and that they were doing the right thing. God's work even. bringing light to the darkness of the continent.
Let's get back on topic. Can you tell us more about the cultural and societal changes of the time?
Yes, well, prior to 1945, when the United Gold Coast Convention, or UGCC, started to gain momentum, there was mostly British rule, and while there were native representatives in government, in actuality, government implemented there was in favor of the colonists. To mirror this, there was, in a sense, of overall British dominance over the people, and forced cultural and societal assimilation. Both the changes in government and the uprising of the people aiming for self-governance, starting around the time of the United Gold Coast Convention. While there were struggles, things took a change for the better. And after several years of battle, the Ghanaian people finally gained independence, marked by native Kwame Nkrumah taking office as president. But, like I said, even though they have independence, there's still a lot of British culture left behind.
We have to go in a little bit, but before you go, can you please give some examples of what British influence was left behind?
In big things like governmental and educational makeup, even the small things out there like boxing and soccer, European and Western sports are popular over there.
And thanks to everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been watching World News. Today, we've covered the changes in art, education, and culture from 1890 to the 1960s within the countries of Ethiopia and Ghana.
Well, that's all we have, folks. I'm Jose Martinez.
And I'm John Doe.
And thank you for watching World
World
News.
News!